Hi, my name is Dan and I'm one of the DT evangelists here at Digital-Tutors. In this video, we're going to look at a question from one of our users on how final gather rays are cast into the scene differently than global illumination photons. So to illustrate this, I have a very simple scene set up here with the knife from the Introduction to Modeling in Maya course. We can see I have a render camera, and if I hop into my hypershade here, I don't have any lights in my scene. Okay, so let's begin by pulling in some geometry that the final gathering can actually use in order to help light our scene. So I'll pull in something like a simple polygon plane, and then I'll come in back to my hypershade here and create a surface shader. That way it doesn't have any shading or anything like that. Just drop that onto our plane, and then I'll go ahead and make that color white. So that way the final gather rays can use that lighting in our scene. Now before I render this out, I'm just going to hop into my render settings real quick and make sure that my default light is disabled. So I have absolutely no light being cast into our scene. Now let's come in, turn on final gathering, and let's render this out to see how this looks. So as we can see, it's a little dark, but we can see that we actually have light coming off of this poly plane. So even though we don't have any lights in our scene, we're still getting some what appears to be light here in our scene from the final gather. Now, final gathering works by casting rays out from the camera into our scene, and that's the reason why it doesn't really need any lights in our scene. Now, we can really get a better idea of this by turning on a feature called the Map Visualizer. Let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to hop into my render settings again. And under Final Gathering, we can enable the Map Visualizer. So once we have that enabled, we can render this back out. And while our render isn't going to look any different, we can see now in our scene how our final gather rays have been calculated. So we can see they're really being calculated from the angle of the camera here. So on the back side, even though it's using this plane as light, we're not getting any rays here because they're not being seen by the camera. So it's being cast in from this direction. So to contrast this, let's take a look at how the photons for global illumination are cast into the scene. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this plane. I'm going to get rid of my map visualizer as well by coming into my rendering editor, and under map visualizer we can delete that, and that'll clear that from our scene. So now let's pull in a light that we can apply some global illumination to. So I'll just pull in something like an area light. I'll position it similar to where we had our plane, our polyplane. And I'm going to come in and turn the intensity down so it's not actually casting light into the scene. But I do want to turn on my photons. Now I also need to enable global illumination in my render settings. While I'm at it, I'll go ahead and turn off final gathering and turn on my global illumination. And let me select my light again, and I'm going to bump up the number of photons. Global illumination sometimes can require quite a few photons in order to give us some decent results. And since really I'm just wanting to see how these photons are cast into the scene, I'm going to bump up the number there. And actually I forgot to turn on my visualizer for the global illumination. We can find that under our photon map. We can once again enable a visualizer, very similar to final gathering, the way that the visualizer works at least. Okay, so let's render this out. And right away we can see that our render is completely different than it was with our final gathering. But if we look in our scene now, since we had the map visualizer turned on, we can see how our photons are being cast into the scene. We can see definitely they're coming from the side of the light here and not coming from the camera. Now we have a few that are leaking over onto this side, but the majority are coming from this direction here. So that's a very quick look at how we can see how the final gather rays are cast in the scene as opposed to how the global illumination photons are cast in the scene by utilizing the map visualizer. Now, to learn some more in-depth workflows for these two rendering techniques, I'd recommend checking out either the metal ray workflows in my courses for both Global Illumination and Final Gathering.